Doom v Vamos v Vamos Epicureans. This is the BCE Comics Pod one-shot edition. I'm your host, Nick Smith, and I'm joined by...
Stojr from Stojr Shelf. How's it going, Nick?
I'm doing well, particularly since we are participating in Kurtis Findlay's Epic Marvel Podcast Reading Club, and this one-shot is going to be our brief thoughts on today's issue, which is Wolverine number 4, Honor. Alright, so Wolverine dismantles Lord Yoshida's criminal empire, during which many hand ninjas and Mariko's husband are killed. Ultimately, he faces Yoshida once again in a duel, and this time Wolverine wins and kills the daimyo. Well, Mariko, rather than seeking revenge, actually acknowledges that she had planned on killing her father anyway because of the disgrace he had brought to the family, and instead... Well, not instead. I mean, the father's still dead. Anyway, Wolverine and Mariko then announce their intent to marry because, well, Mariko is her own woman now with her husband dead. All right, Stojr, what are your thoughts?
So I love the cover. Like, I think the coloring and the shading of him lighting his cigar or cigarette, whatever it's supposed to be here. Usually it's a cigar, but it looks a little small for that. It looks really cool. Seeing him with a crossbow is not something you're normally seeing Wolverine with, so that's a cool shot. I think him taking down a lot of this villainous enterprise all looks really cool. I would say like the art is like hit or miss for me though. So like on 234 and 235, like him taking things out, like there's a lot of like quibbles I would have with some of the art on the next two pages. Whether it's like kind of that view of him like crawling at the top of the top right, or how big some of the images look. Like his cowl looks huge on the top right in the shadows. That you can write that off as like it's a shadow. It's supposed to look that way. But like even his claws look extra long on the left hand side of the page. So, but then when you go to future pages, like I think Miller does an excellent job of distinguishing facial expressions, right? Like you can tell who looks Japanese and who looks American without it looking stereotypical or cartoony or anything like that. So he does a really good job with that, or at least in this book he does, because nobody's face when there's a close up looks bad or looks cartoony. They all kind of have, with maybe the exception of Yukio, like, but then again, like it's hard to tell with her because that is a lot of like how the 80s style was with those like that like pixie cut of the haircut and things like that. So to us looking back on it, it looks a little odd, but if this was back then, it may not look as weird. But I really, even whether it's the husband or the father throughout this, they all have very distinct characteristics and look very different from each other. Yet at the still same time, their ethnicity comes through. And I think that's a hard thing to do for some artists, and Miller does a great job of it. So I've been picking on his art a little bit because I think it's really good, but there's pieces of it that I'm not like crazy about. So I wanted to also throw out some of those compliments on it. The sword fight and the fight with the claws is really strong. Looking at pages 249 through 251, and that the fact that like he has to take the dad out with his claws is a fitting kind of end, right? He gets his fist up there real close, and all he has to do is pop those claws. That's really cool for Wolverine as you go through this. Although he's got his claws out the whole fight, so he just retracts them just for that one like little style element there, right? Like at the top of the page he's got his claws out and he retracts them for no reason because he's had them out the entire fight, and then he pops it at the end. So whether that was like a purposeful thing or just an artistic thing to kind of get him set up to do that, either way, it's pretty cool looking. Also a little odd that like her dad and her husband like died like 5 seconds ago, and then like they're already planning their wedding. That's a little quick, but I get it. We got to wrap the story up. There's only so many pages left.
Well,
And then the last thing from an art perspective, I'll pick on Miller a little bit. The X-Men don't look too odd on the last page. Like they don't look as familiar as I would like. But what really stands out is the wedding invitation, and maybe that's because we see Paul Smith drawing it on the cover of the very next page. So Wolverine looks very blocky, very much what we get later in Miller's art on the left-hand side of the page, and looks much more natural in Paul Smith's version on the cover of the next page. And I thought that was just an interesting compare and contrast because it's literally the same picture, just drawn by two artists side by side. We don't get that often in collected editions to see that type of stuff. Overall, though, as a conclusion to the Wolverine miniseries and getting us to where we have to pick up the next issue of Uncanny X-Men, I think it's really good. If I take a step back, and we could talk about this more in the next issue when we talk about Uncanny X-Men, the whole relationship between Wolverine and Mariko really has a roller coaster with what we're going to see coming up soon. And it's all kind of, I mean, what is this, like a week? Like time's a little bit hard because you kind of have to pick up in little subtext in Claremont's writing about how long things take, right? To us, it maybe seems like a couple days, but weeks or months might go by, in a flash between panels. But if I say that this all stuff happened over the course of a couple weeks here, there's a lot of different back and forth changes between this couple that happens in that short period of time.
Sure.
What did you think of this issue?
Yeah, so let me get the comic viewer sorted out there. I really enjoyed it. It was a fantastic ending. And I understand the quibbles about the art. That one scene with Wolverine crawling down, I thought he looked like a Spider-Man pose. That's unnatural for Wolverine. A guy with adamantium bones, I wouldn't think would be that flexible, right? So that did feel a little weird. But otherwise, I think the way that Miller sets up his panels, the way that the layout of the pages and so forth, I think is excellent. I'm going to go back to that hand ninja fight on page 244. Oh, no, wait, I've got two different hand ninja fights I want to talk about. But this one on page 244, where we just see all of these dead ninjas, I thought was really interesting. The coloring is very good on it because it's very different and varied. And I feel like we finally see the brutality of Wolverine on this page. Now, we don't actually see him creating this, but we see the aftermath of what he's done, right? We have been told throughout the X-Men that Wolverine is this brutal, unbridled killer, but we don't actually see that all that much, right? We see him fight, but we don't really see the dead bodies. Well, here they are, right? Here are the dead bodies that are left in Wolverine's wake. Let's see, the coloring on page 245 with the death of Mariko's husband, this is also fantastic. It feels like this should be against the comics code, right? With this yellow background with the red splatter on it, and his face is all in red. We're not actually seeing blood being spilled, right? We're just seeing an artistic effect, and yet it gives that impression. It gives the reader the belief that this is what's happening, is his blood is being spilled on the background. So I thought, again, that was a really good way to evoke the death of this guy without actually showing anything too gruesome.
And if you just stay there for 1 second,
Sure.
like similarly with the hand fight, they get away with things by setting up the hand as dead ninjas that turn to smoke or dust after you kill them. So you don't get a lot of blood on the left-hand side of the page. You get all of this kind of, steamy kind of smokiness that comes out of their bodies, evoking that they're now dead. And, as opposed to this bloody scene, right? You could almost paint all that red, with the exception of maybe the bottom panel, but like the middle of the page, you could paint a lot of that red and say, hey, look, there's blood splatters everywhere, but the hand has this like out, to get around that stuff, that they're dead, and then if you kill them, they just kind of melt away to smoke or something like that.
Yeah, and I kind of appreciate that, right? I feel like sometimes there's certain modern comics that go too far with the blood and the gore, and it's just too much for me. This still conveys the message, and you still get the idea without it just being over the top gory, right? Let's see, one last thing. Well, when it comes to layout and the artwork and so forth that I appreciated, let me get to 248, 249. Here we go. Once again, we get that cinematic effect of the duel here, and I think this is I think it's brilliant. No words are needed. Ending, as you mentioned, with Wolverine simply having his fan to Yoshida's face, and then that final panel. Wait a minute, I'm on the wrong page. Here we go. 251. All right, so again, that final panel there, where we just see Wolverine's eyes in red, and then the word "snicked." The reader knows exactly what's happened without having to actually show it, right? So again, we're not just bathing ourselves in blood and so forth, but the message is still conveyed. We know exactly what has happened here. So I thought that was really well done. And then even more from the layout. Sorry, this is something that just struck me. So I've been talking about how there's these wide but short kind of cinematic panels, and that gets played up in these duels. Well, then when you go to the very next page, it's all vertical panels now, right? They're very tall, they're very thin, and automatically we're taken out of the intense feeling of the battle and the duel into something calmer. And the blue tones of the color really kind of aids in that effect. I mentioned before how go for it.
These pages remind me a bit of, and it might be Rob, kind of influenced by Miller, but like a Rob Liefeld book. And Rob gets a lot of like flack for his art style and stuff like that, but I don't think there's any denying that his layouts and his cinematic, posing of things was cool, right? So you can argue whether you like the way he drew things or whether it's too much of one thing or whatever. But like, this reminded me when I looked at this, I was like, oh, this feels like I'm reading the beginning of X-Force and things like that. Now he would have only had maybe two of these long panels and then plastered like a full pose shot of like Cable or something like that over the other two, as opposed to what Miller does here is all across. But it's interesting, you can almost see where some influences on different artists play in over time.
Yep. I was gonna say in the previous episode, I mentioned how I sometimes just let the art wave over me. Well, I was paying attention to this one. Enough was happening where it kind of stood out to me that, we're playing with the art here and conveying meaning with it in a very interesting and good way. I guess the one last thing that kind of stood out to me that I thought bore mentioning, the invitation to the wedding, right? His Imperial Majesty Hirohito, Emperor of Japan, requests the pleasure of your company at the wedding of Lady Mariko of Clan Yoshida to Logan. So we've already established that Mariko is her family is high up. Makes sense that the Emperor of Japan is somehow involved here. But the name caught my eye. I was like, wait a minute, Emperor Hirohito, that's the Emperor of Japan during the Second World War. It's the same emperor, right? Hirohito became Emperor of Japan in 1926. He was emperor during the militaristic buildup of the island and through the Second World War, and he was still emperor in the 80s. I did a little bit of digging. After the war, Hirohito managed to not be held accountable for war crimes, at least according to Wikipedia. When I was looking at this, I didn't bother to do a deep dive into all this. But he avoided being held accountable for war crimes because U.S. General Douglas MacArthur withheld some evidence to ensure that Hirohito remained on the throne. MacArthur wanted to have the emperor working with the American occupying forces, and the emperor was the symbol of unity for the Japanese people. The thought was that if they kept that unity, if they kept the emperor in place, it would avoid unrest on the island as we were occupying it, right? And, you could say that worked. We didn't get a lot of unrest in Japan. Once Japan was occupied, the United States helped draft a new constitution for the island that basically made, the emperor was still head of state, but he was mostly a figurehead. Essentially, we created a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, kind of like what Britain has. Hirohito dies in 1989. All right, so he's very much alive in 1982 when this was released. He was still the emperor. I just, there's that disconnect in my mind of, I grew up in the 80s. It never occurred to me that the Emperor of Japan during the Second World War was still the Emperor of Japan in the 80s. But yep, that's him.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It makes me think about how, there's that joke that like, when you hit 40, you have to choose as a man. You either start to smoke meat or go deep into World War II history. And I think I chose to go deep into this collection of things on my wall, as opposed to those things. But the World War II history stuff is so interesting, and I mean, I'm sure I don't have to tell you as a history professor, but even if when you get into something small like dropping of the bomb, and you start to
Something
realize,
small.
well, wait,
Sorry.
well, yeah, I mean, like just I mean, small in the scheme of like one decision,
Sure.
right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
there's so many things, um, but but the firefight or the fire bombings that happened in Japan, and how devastating those were. Like those were worse in some ways than it was. The fact that it was more about the fact that we had to drop two bombs to really get the effect than it was the casualties from one bomb, right?
Yeah.
Because they already had the casualties from the fire bombings, and that wasn't working. And again, that's everything I just said is very much from a statement of like, how the military leaders of the U.S. were trying to make the decision of what to do. I'm not endorsing or provoking one side of that story and saying that's the only perspective, but it's so interesting when you get into the weeds of this stuff, and you just laid out another interesting point that the emperor had to stick around. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the withholding evidence can't really speak to that part, but the idea of that sort of continuity, and having somebody that you can control, I guess, is maybe MacArthur's thought process too. It's pretty smart.
Yeah. I guess it's an example of realpolitik, right? Yep. In an ideal world, the man should have been held accountable for the crimes he committed, but then you start you're weighing that moral conundrum, right? Do you accept a lesser evil to prevent a greater evil? And that's I guess where MacArthur went. And I guess a good thing too. We can criticize actions towards Japan and Germany during the war, post the war, whatever, but we managed to integrate both of those countries into being members of the world community. Whereas the collapse of the Soviet Union, we didn't do such a good job of integrating them. We tried, but they've now slipped back into a dictatorship, right? So, granted, the situation's completely different. There was no reason for us to occupy the Soviet Union. Blah blah. Anyway, this is a comic book podcast. We don't need to worry about all the history stuff and politics and so forth. All right, Stojr. Any other final thoughts?
No, I think what I'll say is that the straight up connection that, and part of this is because Claremont's the writer, but whether it's between New Mutants that we saw last time with them watching TV and the Brood, or here with the Wedding Invitation, and kind of leading directly to why the X-Men are coming in the next issue to Japan. They're doing such a great job of like keeping this as stuck together and coherent as possible. So it's an enjoyable read, especially in this epic collection.
Yeah, I do think the 80s is an excellent time for this, that you do get a lot of that. The continuity is held to, but it doesn't overwhelm the stories. You can still read these things separately without having to read New Mutants at the same time. Although I'm kind of sad we're not reading New Mutants at the same time, but that's okay. We'll get to them at some point.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, if you've enjoyed our thoughts on comics, or I guess on related history history ramblings, follow us on YouTube. We're going to read, rate, and review a full big collected edition comic once a month, plus these daily one-shots. Once again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.